Yes, thank you. I've been asking my questions all day to various politicians, but this is when you ask your questions about Brexit, and hopefully we get to answer them. We've got Jill Rutter here for us this afternoon, Senior Research Fellow at UK in a Changing Europe. Jill, thanks very much for being with us to answer the questions. On Twitter, most of these are from Daniel. First of all, can the Prime Minister reject any extension from the EU? We know the EU ambassador has been meeting today to discuss an extension. Could the Prime Minister reject any extension?
Not on his own, no. I mean, one of the points, remember, of that Act, the Ben Act, that MPs enacted in September was to take the question of extension out of the Prime Minister's hands. So if the EU proposes 31st of January, he has to accept it. If they propose a different date, which is possible, we've heard some sort of arguments going on in the EU about what they do, then he can only reject it with the consent of Parliament. So he'd have to put a motion to Parliament. Parliament would have to agree that that they go with a different date, or indeed no date. So,
all right. Jeff is asking, how much will we have to pay the European Union during an extension?
Well, the interesting thing is actually it really just changes where things are on the balance sheet. As part of the deal, if we have a deal, we effectively keep paying our contribution that we owed under the 2014 to 2020 EU financial framework, I think called the multi-annual financial framework. We keep paying that till December 2020. If we're in an extension, we keep paying that. We count it as a budget contribution from a member state. If we'd left, we'd count it as part of our financial settlement, but it doesn't change the amount at all. So if you want the answer, does it make any difference if we extend to how much we pay? The answer is no, if we leave with a deal. If we left without a deal, some people would say we wouldn't pay that financial settlement, but the EU has made absolutely clear that the moment we want to start talking about trade with them again, they would be saying, what about all that money you owe us?
Joe is asking, why does Boris Johnson want an election? Of course, he's been calling for an election on December the 12th. Why does he want an election?
That's probably one to go to the Downing Street strategist rather than just somebody from a think tank. But let's try and ask, why might he want an? One of which is that he is governing in a minority position. He's actually made that worse by expelling those Tories who rebelled against him from the party. But it's very clear, and it was very clear when Theresa May was trying to govern, that actually it's very difficult for government to get its business through Parliament. So I think if he wants to be a Prime Minister who does things, and he was put a lot of emphasis about his ambitious Queen's speech, if he wants to actually have a big controversial legislative programme, he needs a majority. Slightly more venally, he might be looking at the polls and thinking, actually, I'm doing quite well at the moment. That's quite a good time to go, whatever, the opposition appears divided. So tactically, it might be a good time to go. And third, next year, he's got some really difficult negotiations coming up, because although he will say, I've got Brexit done if he gets his deal through, that's the easy part. That's part one. Doesn't seem easy, hasn't for the last 3 years. But part two is, what's our future relationship? And that's likely to be every bit as controversial in Parliament. We've already seen some skirmishing about that as the withdrawal agreement. So with a majority of his own and of his type of Conservative as well, so a Conservative Party more in the Johnson image, he would have a freer rein to negotiate the sort of Brexit he wants long term.
Brett is asking, what happens if the deadline is extended to January the 31st, which looks quite likely, but no election is called, so that the situation essentially that exists at the moment remains?
That's all speculation. So what would not change? What would not change would be the UK would still be an EU member. We would still be facing a no-deal exit, assuming the deal hasn't been approved on 31st of January. But the other thing we still know is there is a no-deal majority in that Parliament. So we might expect to see, though the one thing that would change would be a different speaker. We might expect to see MPs try to do what they did in September and ensure that the Prime Minister couldn't take the UK out of the EU without a deal. We might also see patience really beginning to fray in the EU. We know President Macron is not very keen on another extension now. Every time we ask for an extension, the EU's patience, I think, goes down a bit. So we might see slightly more fraught talks about extending again, but we might just find ourselves on repeat from now.
Andy is asking, can't we have an election and a referendum at the same time?
That sounds really good sense, actually. In some ways, you could say, let's, two for the price of one, let's just solve everything. And then we could say, actually, you can vote on the election on the issues like the health service, education, those sorts of issues, and make your mind up on Brexit at the same time. But the Electoral Commission, which is the body that regulates elections in this country, has warned very strongly against doing that, because while it obviously would be cheaper, you need to book one bunch of polling station things, they think there's a real danger that you would end up with two parallel campaigns confusing the electorate, and you could produce a very sort of muddled outcome. So their strong advice is you shouldn't do both at the same time.
Okay, but although it's theoretically possible.
Theoretically, I think it's possible.
Yeah.
I mean, what we do need to do, you need to watch the timings as well, because we can do elections, you know, after 5 weeks, 25 calendar days, slightly less than 5 weeks. Referenda take quite a lot longer because we don't have any standing legislation about having a referendum. So you have to have quite a long process to put a bill through Parliament, decide who gets to vote. Might not be the same franchise as general election franchise, so might have different people who can vote in one, not the other. You have to decide the question. The Electoral Commission is supposed to consult on the question to make sure that it's fair between the two sides. And so there are a whole bunch of different processes that run, so I think that would be quite confusing as well.
Very quickly, we're running out of time, but Howard wants to know, what would it take to guarantee that a no-deal exit is off the table? Jeremy Corbyn's been saying if Boris Johnson can guarantee that, then he'd go for an election.
If you really wanted to guarantee it definitively, there are only two ways of guaranteeing it definitively. One is to pass a deal. That sounds a bit like Theresa May. The second one is to revoke Article 50 and stop the whole process.
Jill Rutter, thank you very much indeed from UK in a Changing Europe. Many thanks indeed for answering all those questions.